Good afternoon, everyone. It's Jeremy Benamy, president of J Street, coming to you from Washington, D.C., and we have a very interesting and I hope informative webinar and timely webinar today. We're going to be getting started in about 20 to 30 seconds. This is a very well-attended session, and it takes a little time for Zoom to load everyone in. So we're going to give it a few seconds as we are joined by somewhere between 500 and 1,000 folks who have signed up for today's webinar. July 1, today's date, has been anticipated now for quite some time, ever since the signing of a coalition agreement in Israel that's set today as the date for the beginning of the consideration of the possibility of annexation of territory on the West Bank. As we've been saying for quite some time, July 1st was not really a deadline or a finish line. It really was the starting line for the consideration of annexation, and the decision being made by Israel at this moment is vital to determining the future of the state of Israel, its character, its relations with its neighbors, its relations with the broader global community, and with Jews all around the world. J Street has been very clear that we believe that annexation is wrong on nearly every conceivable score. It's bad for Israel's own interests and for its security. It is bad for America's interests in the Middle East. It is counter to our democratic and shared values, our Jewish values. It is bad for Palestinians. It undermines the rule of law, and it kicks away a crucial underpinning of the international world order that has kept the world stable in the many decades since World War II. So for several months, J Street has been focused on demonstrating to Israeli and American decision makers the breadth of opposition to annexation in the United States and the potential damage that such a step could do to the U.S.-Israel relationship and the broad bipartisan support for Israel that has existed for decades, as well as the relationship between many Jewish Americans and the state of Israel. This afternoon, we're going to hear from four really significant elected officials, 2 American and 2 Israeli, about their view of annexation and their view of the impact that such a step would have on the U.S.-Israel relationship and the steps that might be taken by the United States in coming years to press Israel to reverse such a step if, in fact, it is taken. I'll be introducing each of the 4 in order. They'll each get a question from me, but I'm sure they'll say whatever's on their mind, no matter the question. We will give you each about 5 minutes for the opening, and then we'll have a exchange of ideas, and we'll take some questions in the Q&A. I'm sure everybody on Zoom is familiar at this point with the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to plug in your questions there. So with that having been said, and we're all here, let's get started. I'm going to first introduce Senator Chris Van Hollen. Chris Van Hollen is a senator from the wonderful state of Maryland, my home senator. He's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and most recently, he is the lead co-author with Senators Chris Murphy and Tim Kaine, and was eventually joined by 16 other senators that was part of the Senate's broad opposition stated publicly to annexation. And Senator, I'd love to ask you what message you hope that Israelis will hear when they learn that 80% of Senate Democrats have publicly spoken out in opposition to this step, and get your assessment of the risks that you think annexation poses for the U.S.-Israel relationship should, in fact, the Prime Minister move forward with something in the coming days. Senator.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you and J Street for convening this gathering at this very important moment. Welcome to the members of the Knesset. Look forward to sharing the conversation with you and with my friend Jan Schakowsky from the House side. And the purpose of that letter was to send a very clear signal that to move forward with unilateral annexation would be a reversal, a betrayal of the understandings that Israel, the United States, the Palestinians, and the international community have had for a very long time with regard to how we resolve the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And the architecture for that has been a two-state solution, ensuring we have a secure Jewish state, but also recognizing the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people for self-determination, for human rights, and for a viable and contiguous state of their own. And all of us know that the prospects of a two-state solution have already been on life support. This would really be the final nail in the coffin. So let me just make a couple key points with respect to the fallout. First of all, this will harm U.S. national security interests around the world. Second, it will hurt both American and Israeli regional interests throughout the Middle East. Third, I agree with the assessment that it will undermine the idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And in doing that, it will undermine and hurt U.S. relations, which to date have been based not just on shared interests, but also on shared values. Let me just talk briefly about the global impact, because the United States has been a leader, a champion of defending the rule of law and the UN Charter. And the reality is that annexing this territory would be a violation of those international norms. And the United States would lose all its credibility around the world when we try to enforce those norms elsewhere, as we have been doing in recent times, and we may have to do going forward. Secondly, within the region, we've heard King Abdullah say that this would lead to a massive conflict. This would undermine the stability of Jordan. And we've heard from the Gulf states that have been working more closely with Israel in recent years on a number of things, including isolating Iran. And of course, it would undermine entirely the credibility of the Palestinian Authority. So the big winners here will be Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Now, with respect to the future of Israel, it was a former Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister, Ehud Barak, who laid out the options going forward. And what he said was we could choose between having one state with equal democratic rights, which he said would, quote, become a binational state with an Arab majority, and he predicted civil war. The alternative was, quote, this is quoting him, the slippery slope toward apartheid, unquote. So when it comes to making sure that we both protect our deep relationship with Israel as a Jewish state and a democratic state, and we recognize both the democratic rights and human rights of Palestinian people, this would undermine that. So I will close just by making the point that I don't believe that U.S. taxpayer dollars should be going to support in any way or encourage or ratify unilateral annexation by Israel. I support a strong defense relationship, but I do not think American dollars should be aiding and abetting the unilateral annexation of territory.
Thank you so much, Senator. And it's really a tremendous pleasure for me to see both American lawmakers who are such passionate supporters both of Israel and of peace in dialogue here with Israeli lawmakers who are leaders of the camp that cares about Israel's future from the perspective of being both a democracy and a national home of the Jewish people. And this kind of a dialogue is something we hope to encourage, and I'm excited to turn next in that spirit to the chair of the Meretz Party, Nitzan Horowitz. Nitzan, you are a longtime friend of J Street. You've spoken at our conferences. You are well known in the progressive movement here in the United States as well. We'd love to hear a bit from you about the state of Israeli political opposition to annexation. How broad does that opposition run in the Knesset across the Israeli political spectrum? And what chance is there that the voices being heard opposing it will have an impact on the decision that the government now needs to make? So I'll turn it to you, and don't forget to unmute yourself before you start speaking.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you all, dear friends. I'm really excited to join you this evening. And really, Jeremy, you're doing an amazing work, and you're helping us a lot. And it's really, I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. You know, when we're talking about unilateral annexation, we're talking about something which goes against the core foundation of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. That is the heart of the Zionist vision, to create here as a Jewish and democratic nation. If we annex millions of Palestinians, we will lose this vision and we will become an apartheid state. I'm really sorry to say this, but this is the situation if we go along with this disastrous annexation. Now, there are many other reasons why annexation is bad for Israel and bad for the Palestinians. To begin with the economic burden, now we're in the midst of this huge corona crisis. We have millions of unemployed people, and we don't have really the money, billions of shekels to spend every year on hundreds of new frontier lines, on the security measures, on infrastructure. This is just totally insane. Same goes for the Palestinians. Also from a military point of view, and it's important to notice and to emphasize that the high command of the Israeli military is against unilateral annexation, because this will put an extra burden on our security, because this will lead to, unfortunately, to bloodshed and violence, and we do not need this. Now, today was the date in which annexation was supposed to begin. It didn't begin. It didn't begin. Why? Because we had a huge campaign here in Israel and among Israeli friends of Israel abroad, among Jewish communities, to stop annexation. All over the media, Israeli opinion polls, for instance, there is a majority of Israelis against annexation. This is very important to understand. More than 65% of Israelis are against annexation. And they're not really interested in this issue. They are preoccupied with the economic crisis, with the corona crisis. They just don't need this, this thing on the table now. And with this overwhelming majority of Israelis against annexation, we were doing a huge campaign in the last month or two, including demonstrations, including all sorts of parliamentary maneuvers, media events, and of course, contacting friends of Israel all over the world. And, you know, all those voices together, of course, with our Palestinian neighbors, the Jordanian king, the Egyptians, all the players in the area, European leaders. Even today, this morning, the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, made an article in Hebrew in Israel's largest newspaper, calling for Israel not to make this disastrous move of annexation. So we see here a broad coalition, Jeremy, of, and I would call them friends of Israel, who wants Israel's best interest, and that is peace and stability and security and democracy. And I'm proud as a leader of a progressive party in Israel that we were part of this effort. Now, I think that the most important lesson today to understand July 1st is that everything is still open. Everything is up to change. And if we had this campaign so far, we need to continue, because this might happen later on. You know, the settlers didn't give up their dream of annexation, and we should keep the pressure. And the pressure works. And this is obvious. The pressure works. Now, also another important, very important issue. Let's assume that we stop annexation and this thing is gone. Well, if we're again into occupation and military occupation and nothing is going forward, then we didn't achieve much. We have to stop annexation because this is a very serious danger for Israelis and Palestinians. But then we should use this momentum of stopping annexation in order to revive the peace process based on the two-state solution. Because if we're stuck again with this occupation and there will be more settlements and more outposts just to compensate the settlers for the failure of annexation, then we gain nothing. So I really call upon all of you to keep the good work and to use this momentum that we achieved in the last couple of weeks in order to move from stopping annexation to reviving the peace process based on the two-state solution, which is the only viable solution for Israelis and Palestinians to live peacefully in this holy land, dear to all of us. And I feel a bit optimistic today after many weeks of deep worry, because we did something significant, and I hope we all together we will continue this effort, and we will be able to see some sort of revival of the real thing, which is the peace process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nitzan, for the hopeful and inspiring words. Part of the tremendous campaign that has been built to demonstrate opposition to the prospect of annexation has been done in the House of Representatives with the leadership of Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, who is one of the dearest and nearest friends of J Street and one of the true champions of our cause. She, along with Ted Deutsch, David Price, and Brad Schneider, were the leaders of a letter that last Thursday was sent by 191 members of the House of Representatives to Prime Minister Netanyahu. She also, I think just yesterday or this morning, featured in a Knesset meeting of your anti-annexation caucus, and it is really a goal that will increase that cooperation further between you and the Congress. Congresswoman, your letter expressed deep reservations about annexation due to the potential implications of annexation for Israel's security, among other factors. Why do you think the letter gained such broad support in the caucus? And what should Israeli lawmakers and activists hear in your message and take to heart? And how do you think we can best amplify the message that you have tried to deliver? Congresswoman.
Well, I think there was a good deal of smart politics involved in getting the numbers that we did on the letter. And I think what people that were being, our members that were being solicited, look for the names. They look to see, am I going to be safe to sign on to a letter opposing annexation? And the thought from the beginning was likely suspects like myself and David Price were going to fill the bill, that we needed to get people like Ted Deutsch and to get Brad Schneider, who are not regular critics of the state of Israel and Bibi Netanyahu. But everyone who signed that begins from a place. And I want our Knesset member, Mr. Horowitz, to understand that, from a place of support for the state of Israel. That, you know, I'd like to think that when we talk about the U.S.-Israel bond, that it is unbreakable. But I want to tell you something. You're seeing cracks in that if they go ahead with annexation. And I think that the message was so strong between what Chris Van Hollen did, what they did in the Senate and the House of Representatives, because I don't think there's a single Israeli that doesn't think that there's importance to the U.S. opinions. Frankly, Chris, your ending words were a little bit surprising to me, and I want to focus on that because there is another letter. I don't know how many signatures it has, but there are some people, including AOC, if that's a name familiar to all of you, that are on a letter. Maxine Waters just talked to me about it, hoping that I would get on it, that begins to talk now about conditioning money for the state of Israel. Now, Joe Biden has criticized annexation, but has made it clear he's not talking about conditioning money. But I have told my consul general very personally on the phone, I've talked to Israelis and said, make no mistake, this will come up for sure if you do this. There will be, I said, you know, may not be from me, and it may not, it certainly, you know, won't be from some others in the, but it will jeopardize the bipartisan support for Israel, and it will begin to put on the table the question of conditioning money to Israel. I was so encouraged to hear the polling data that you gave us, that 65+% of Israelis are against annexation. And I think that partnership between what you're doing, the progressives in Israel are doing, and what we're doing here at home in demonstrating majorities, demonstrating the vast majority of the Democratic caucus. And that's the other thing that I don't understand the timing. Some may say, well, we better, some in Israel may be saying, maybe Bibi is saying, we better do it now because we have this president. But I want to tell you something. We're 4 months away from an election that I think could be transformational. And you're going to see different conditions and different players that are going to be voting on these things and making decisions, and a different foreign policy that you're going to see from a Joe Biden versus a Donald Trump administration. Seems very bad timing to me to not heed what Joe Biden has said, what the Congress is saying on the part of Israel. And so congratulations that it appears today that decision has at least been postponed. And let me end with this. I was also very encouraged by what you were saying, Mr. Horowitz, going next. What is the follow-up? And I know we're talking about that in the Congress. We're talking about it with J Street. This is very, very important. We have to have a plan for even after if we defeat annexation. What is it? Are we going to move back to the negotiating table? Is a two-state solution really back on the table? I want to make one more point that I've been telling my consul general and my friends. Not only is there going to be a new election, but we have a new generation. This is a generational issue as well. And I want to tell you that I think that a lot of the next generation of Jews, to the extent that they care about Israel, and many do, but some don't, it's not a big deal for them, they are social justice Jews by and large. And so when they talk now, that same group, about Black Lives Matter, you can add in Palestinian Lives Matter. There's that new concern, not new concern, but this growing concern that Barack Obama has called an awakening. And I think under that same banner comes justice for Palestinians, justice for Arabs. And so for all the other reasons that Chris mentioned, the foreign policy concerns, the national security concerns, all of those are so important. Add to that I think we have to worry about making sure the next generation of Jewish leaders in the United States of America are going to be there for Israel if it moves ahead with ideas as bad as this one. So I'm going to end there.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. And it's a great segue over to our final opening speaker, MK Ofer Shelah, who is a member of Knesset from the Yesh Atid party. He's the head of the State Control Committee in the Knesset. He's the senior member of his party dealing with national security and foreign policy matters, and probably one of the most important voices on these issues now on the Israeli political scene. And Ofer, I'd like to ask you if you could share us a bit from the Israeli perspective on these shifts in American opinion that both the senator and Congresswoman laid out. And frankly, it's a shift in global opinion as well. And it's all hinged on this prospect of annexation. Do you think the message is registering in Israel that this kind of a step is putting at risk Israel's standing in the global community and its ongoing effort to totally normalize its position in the community of nations? I'm interested to hear your perspective. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks, everybody. This, of course, is a very interesting question, and I'd like in my remarks, and not to try to convince you that annexation is bad. We're friends of a feather in that respect, and there's no use us convincing one another in what we believe in the first place, but try to look at it from a practical political point of view. Nitzan and I have been friends for a long time, but I don't really agree that the internal pressure in Israel was such a great factor in Netanyahu not going forward with annexation today. And I'll begin with commenting, we still don't know. We don't know what Netanyahu is planning for the most obvious reason, which is I'm not sure Netanyahu knows. I headed and Nitzan took part in my committees. We had a meeting today analyzing from a state control. I used the state controller's report to look at the process, not at the end result, because we don't know the end result yet, but look at it from a procedural point of view, saying what were the necessary steps in reaching a good decision taken. And the short answer is, of course, no. We know that the IDF, the Shabak, the Internal Security, the Justice Department, we're talking about what is called in Israel not annexation, or at least by Netanyahu, not annexation, but putting those territories under Israeli law. And the Justice Department here in Israel knows nothing about it, was not a part of the process, and so on. And so we don't know yet where this is going. And of course, under the broad outline of annexation, there are several possibilities. You may talk about them because Netanyahu is under such great pressure from his base. And right now he's in a position, he looks ahead, we look ahead. I dare predict that within a year, we're going to be in elections once again. I don't see the day that Benny Gantz replaces Netanyahu as prime minister. So within a year, we may be there. And Netanyahu definitely is looking towards that possibility. And looking towards that possibility, having done nothing to fulfill his promise on annexation will be a problem for him. Now, he may decide that this is a problem that he'd rather contend with. And I'm going to speak a little later about what we need to do to create a bigger threat on the other side. But we still don't know. And I'm not sure that he made up his mind. A foreign minister, Ashkenazi, said this morning, Israeli time, in an interview, that he still doesn't know and hasn't seen not only maps, but even general ideas what we're talking about. And if he doesn't know, I guess nobody does. So, and in that respect, I want to move forward and say, I'm sure you understand that time is of the essence. You look at the political picture in the United States, Israelis look at it as well. They see Senator Biden leading by a double-digit margin in the polls. They understand he made statements. Him and the Democratic Party made unprecedented statements against annexation, in that he took a stand that you don't usually see a presidential candidate taking. And this registers with Israelis. Because even if you look at the coalition agreement that Blue and White and Likud signed before forming the government, an article there stipulates that basically Netanyahu can bring any form of annexation to the table starting July 1st on his own, if it's in accord with the United States. The only factor, they're not talking about the regional, they're not talking about Jordan or Egypt or the European community, or even Blue and White agreeing to it. Blue and White has no power over it. The only entity that has power to stop this is the United States. And the feeling here in Israel right now the members of Congress who spoke before me know, much better, have much better knowledge of this than I do. That actually the people around President Trump, Jared Kushner or others, who seem to be the ones stalling annexation or working against it, are actually using the Israeli political scene in order to say exert their own pressure. If you don't reach an agreement between blue and white doesn't have that power. But I say this in order to stress the point that yes, I think Washington is the most important place. If you want to influence Netanyahu's decision, if you want to stop this, it begins in Washington, not in Jerusalem. And anything that Nitzan or myself or any other member of Knesset or Israeli politician can do is secondary in that respect, and also secondary in the respect that in the aspect that basically there were polls in Israel. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them that said that 70% of the Israeli public think that the foremost priority for the government is dealing with the economic situation, with the COVID-19 crisis, and 4% think it's annexation. So the Israelis look at it, and this is something that Netanyahu, one of his dubious achievements, was to instill the idea that the whole thing between us and the Palestinians is a zero-sum game. And we gain, they lose, and vice versa. So, let's make hay while this president in Washington, let's not ask ourselves if annexation is good for Israel, but if we can, as they say in Yiddish, chap something, grab something while the going is good, let's do it. But if the threat, if you look at it from the point of view of somebody who wants annexation, of an American administration that will be, and maybe even a House or a Congress in which both houses are controlled by Democrats, will be there in November, that definitely influences Israelis. Having said that, and to follow up on what Congresswoman Schakowsky said, I wouldn't bring money into the picture. First of all, nobody, Americans, Israelis, I think the first reaction to such pressure, you circle the wagons, and the United States is seen as such a great friend, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Israel is being identified with the Republican side since Netanyahu became prime minister, since maybe Governor Romney's visit to Jerusalem before the 2012 election and so on, that saying if the Democrats are in power, if Biden is elected, then what will happen is that they'll stop the money. I think that that'll create a negative reaction in Israel. Now, of course, far be it from me to tell the Americans what to do, and maybe some people around Vice President Biden, think that they should do it. But just to give you the Israeli perspective of it, I don't think that will register. That'll be effective. That'll be counter-effective for Israelis. In general, I would say that when you look at even at polls and deep research done within Israeli society, as opposed to what you would maybe intuitively think, positive aspects work better than negative. It's one of the mistakes by the Israeli left saying, if we don't have peace with the Palestinians, if we don't separate ourselves from the Palestinians, we'll be an apartheid state, we'll be the new South Africa, and the world will deserve it. That may be what you think. If you look at the polls, that works, that is less effective than presenting a positive picture of what would happen if we do have peace and we find our place in the Middle East and borders are opened and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't go there, even for practical purposes. And once again, far be it from me to tell Democratic Party or a Democratic candidate what to say and what to do. I think the one thing that works now for Israelis is the feeling that their government, this whole thing with annexation is so, out of touch with what's happening to us. And Nitzan referred to it earlier. Unemployment, great economic crisis, fear of COVID-19, and so on. And there you are dealing with this thing that, who cares? 4%, only 4% care, whether you're against it or for it. And if you could present it in that sense, and in some way help us create this feeling that here is Netanyahu, fleeing from his poor management of Corona, from his legal problems, from his coalition problems, and finding this thing called annexation, and to hang his hat on, and then to spin public opinion in that way, I think it'd be even more effective. The last thing I want to say is this, Jeremy. You can see it since the beginning of the Second Intifada in the year 2000. Most Israelis support the two-state solution still today. If you ask them, and most Israelis think it's the only viable solution and long-term vision for Israel. And even larger majority thinks that we will not see it in the foreseeable future, maybe not even in our lifetime. But if they understand that annexation, so in that sense, they may say, if we're not going to see it, once again, let's grab something. But if this is presented as something, and I truly believe this not only for presentation purposes, but I truly believe this as something that would block the possibility of ever, should the regime in Ramallah change, the generations, and even for those who think the blame is with the Palestinians. So should there be a generational change on the Palestinian side? If we go forward with annexation, we block this for years to come, if not forever. If you combine all of this, and if this comes from Washington as a message of really caring about Israel, not threatening it, but caring about Israel, and saying this is the wrong thing for you to do, I think that would be the most effective, not only thing that you can do, but the most effective thing in really stopping annexation and stopping Netanyahu from making that decision.
So we've got about 10 minutes of all of your time left, and I want to make sure I give a chance. I want to ask one question of both of the Americans, and I'll ask one question of both of the Israelis. I want to start with Senator Van Hollen, because the remark you made at the very end was then picked up on by Congresswoman Schakowsky and reacted to by MK Shelah. And your statement, to be precise, was that U.S. taxpayer dollars should not be going to pay for annexation. It was not a threat, and it was not a statement that one should reduce the level of support for Israel's security. And I just want to dig into that, because I think it's going to be a very important distinction in the conversation going forward about the nature of our relationship. And I want to see if you wanted to take a moment to sort of dig in a little bit on that, and then turn it back to Jan and see if you wanted to react to what Chris has to say. Oh, and we want to unmute you so we hear the words of wisdom. There we go.
Can you hear me okay? All right. So thanks, Jeremy. If you hadn't asked that question, I plan to clarify, because as you said, there's a major distinction between what I said and what I think may have been interpreted through my remarks. I've been a co-sponsor of legislation to codify the memorandums of understanding and provide robust security assistance to Israel. This is part of what's been the unbreakable bond, and in my view will continue to be unbreakable, in the sense that the United States will always stand up for the security of the state of Israel. But there's a difference between saying we're not going to provide any assistance if someone moves forward with annexation, and saying that the dollars of assistance provided by the United States cannot go to in any way recognize or advance unilateral annexation. This is a very important distinction, because I don't think, for those, I would ask our friends here, we can say, as we all have, that we think unilateral annexation would be very bad for Israel, it'd be bad for the United States, it'd be bad for the region. But then we just say, okay, we're going to provide assistance, even if some of those dollars can be used to advance the cause of unilateral annexation. And so Thank you for making this distinction. I'm not suggesting in any way that we not provide robust security assistance, but I do think it's important to draw the line with respect to those dollars being used to advance unilateral annexation.
And Jan, I just want to turn to you because I think that the question of oversight and accountability and just a little bit more transparency into where American dollars go and what's actually going on is something that's in the air. It doesn't mean in any way sort of taking away America's support for Israel's security. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
No, well, I agree with Chris 100%. If we are, am I unmuted? Okay. If we feel strongly, we have a vast majority of the Democrats that are saying we're against annexation, to extend that to say that not a penny of US dollars should be going to annexation. I also feel strongly we don't want to be paying for demolitions, et cetera. And we may be heading into that kind of arena, but right now we're focusing on annexation. I think that's consistent with what the position that we're taking. It's also true that actually I don't think any of the money, if we envision now what it means to go to annexation, none of the money currently would go that we spend now for Israel. But I understand what my Israeli friend is saying, that we want to envision and present a vision of what the Israel we dream of could be, more than just we're going to punish you. But on the other hand, I agree with Chris that we could also make it clear that there are certain places we don't want the money to go, and it doesn't, in fact.
And I want to shift over to the Israelis and ask you all, you mentioned a little bit, Nitzan and a bit Ofer, that this is a moment when some of these issues are now a little bit back on the agenda. They're being discussed in Israel. There's not usually a lot of conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but this is a moment. And you said, Nitzan, that it's a moment to perhaps try to give a little bit of a positive vision of where we need to go. Where does that come from? It does feel like there needs to be an actual flag planted, and somebody needs to stand up and provide that vision. Do you see that potentially coming out of this, that there'll be a bolder, stronger vision? I asked that of both of you. And I have one other question, which is, if Netanyahu ends up backing down from annexation, he will have to do something, to assuage his right. And I'm curious what you think that might be, because it could be a very negative step that isn't annexation, but it might be something like building an E1, or I'm just curious where you think he might go. So either one.
Building a what, Jeremy?
E1, which is the
E1. Okay.
The area just to the east of Jerusalem that's currently the last connectivity between the north and the south of the West Bank. So Nitzan, I don't know if you want to go first, and Ofer after. And don't forget to unmute.
That's it. So first of all, we have to understand that without a change of leadership in Israel, it would be very difficult to revive the peace process and to talk seriously again about the two-state solution. Because Netanyahu is doing everything he can with his partners to ruin this vision of the two-state solution. So I'm not optimistic about bringing the two-state solution into real negotiation, because this will not happen with Netanyahu. But if there is a change of government in Washington, and if some of, Netanyahu's new partners would be more solid in their stand against him, then with this wave around the annexation issue, we might revive the peace issue within the Israeli public opinion, which is, and here it's not that I disagree with my friend Ofer. It's just that I think that the number one factor is always the Israeli public opinion. This is why I emphasize that it's very important that the majority, overwhelming majority of Israelis is against annexation, because had it been differently, had it been the opposite situation, then it would be much easier for Netanyahu to go forward with his plan. And, even the new defense minister, Mr. Gantz, sort of back down or make more sort of reservation about annexation because he sees the shape of public opinion. So I think that this is an opportunity for the peace camp, not for Netanyahu, and not for the Likud and his parties, but for us to take this as a sign that there is a big public in Israel and all over the world, and of course among Jewish communities, supporting the sane way, the clever way of the two-state solution, and to build upon that. Now, it's not going to be easy, but at least that is something that we should do. Now, in terms of our relations with Washington, this is of extreme importance, and this is why, and I'm saying this here. I was criticizing the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mr. David Friedman, and I said, after talking to some other American officials and of course to Israeli officials, that Mr. Friedman is pursuing his own personal agenda on this matter, and he is not representing even not the American administration, and of course not the Jewish community in America. And I told him, I said that if he wants the good things for Israel, and if he cares really about Israel, he should listen to Israelis. He should listen to the friends of Israel all over the world.
We don't like your ambassador. We don't like your ambassador either. I just thought I'd say that.
So yeah, fine. You're right. And this was a very strong argument. Now, let me be clear on the money issue. Okay, I'm not in favor of sanctions, and I don't like threats. But we all have to understand. Let's talk about Europe, for instance. Europe is the biggest donor of the Palestinian Authority. Okay, 600 million euros a year. Fine. Now, without European money, there will be no Palestinian Authority, okay? And the consequences for Israel would be grave. Now, if this whole idea of the two-state solution would be gone, why should they finance an idea that is non-existent? We have to, it's not a sanction upon Israel, it's not a threat, it's just a reality. They have other clients for this money. They have their own needs now, especially with the crisis. So we have to understand that if we put obstacles on the stability and on the peace track here in the region, then other elements like other, foreign players like Europe, like the US, would be much more reserved, and they would think 10 times before they allocate more money or they continue the same allocation as before. So this is just, this is just reality, and this is just common sense. And I think that when we explain this to Israelis, they do understand, and they don't see it as a threat or a sanction, but just as reality, just as things as they are. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Nitzan. I know I'm very conscious of the time. I know people have other things they need to get to. I want to make sure we get to Ofer Shelah for a final thought on some of these issues. Ofer.
Yeah, I was referring, Jan, basically when you talk about US dollars coming to Israel, I mean official dollars, not business, then all you're talking about is it's not all in the sense that it's the largest amount of foreign aid that the United States is giving to any country. But basically right now it's the 3.8 billion a year dollars that are allocated for Israel's security. And so Israelis would have no other way but interpreting it as they're not going to say that this dollar is going towards annexation and that dollar is towards maintaining Israel's QME vis-a-vis the regional foes that we have. And so I think it'd be very difficult should the president. And once again, I don't need to remind you that the 2016 MOU, basically Congress, the bump that the Congress used to give this money is gone. Basically, it's a hard cap of 3.8 billion decided by the administration, and Congress is at least officially preventing from intervening. And if Israelis look at it, and there's a Democratic president coming in and saying, I'll have second thoughts about the military aid to Israel, that this is what I refer to will be construed by Israelis in a very negative way. But Israelis are very worried and critical of Netanyahu, in that Israel has become is no longer a bipartisan thing in Washington. And this is very obvious in Israel. It's reflected also, of course, in our relationship with the Jewish community and with the reform movement and conservative movement within the Jewish community. Israelis are aware of this. And therefore, if you ask me, Jeremy, what I think, and I try to combine this with your question about the two-state solution, I think that should there be a Democratic administration or even a majority, only a majority in Congress, should there be a plan that presents an alternative idea to the Trump plan and presents it on the basis of a regional arrangement, a regional pact that Israel is part of? I called it, I wrote an article in Haaretz, and I called it the real deal of the century. And the real deal of the century is a Middle East led by America's allies. And those allies happen to be Israel's, they have joint interests with Israel, especially vis-a-vis Iran. And if that vision is led by the United States and the US administration is saying, we're going to support this in any way possible, we're going to bring the regional players in, we're going to break this mold of a zero-sum game that the Trump plan is also based on, and present it and bring the world into it and so on. If there is such an alternative plan, then the Israeli public would see it as a democratic administration or democratic control of Congress, which is positive towards Israel, which brings back bipartisanship, which breaks this very worrying identification that Netanyahu created with not only one side of the political map, but one side of the political map within the Republican side of the political map. If you present such a vision, you in general, of course, I think that'll have a major effect in making once again the idea of a two-state solution viable and practical in Israel, in the Israeli mind. Because as I said, most Israelis support it, but even a larger majority just don't think we're going to see it in the foreseeable future.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. It's a vision that I hope a next administration, we have a lot of work to do, Senator and Congressman, we have a lot of work to do in November to make sure that we have the opportunity for a different path come January.
Yeah, you got to win the elections first, Jim.
Exactly. We have some work to do here to get on the right path, and hopefully in 2021 we can see an administration and a Senate and a House that are laying out a vision that has a positive and hopeful outcome the way that you have just laid it out. I want to thank our incredible 4 participants. This was a wonderful call. The time just slipped away. There's so many more questions, so many more things to say, but you're all very busy. I just want to say thank you for everything that you're doing to both secure Israel's future, to try to take it in a different direction, and here in the United States to try to ensure that there is a positive relationship between the two countries that's grounded in shared interests and values. And I thank all 4 of you on behalf of J Street, and ask all of you who are watching to keep an eye out for our future conversations tomorrow at noon. I'm talking with Daniel Levy about what are some of the policy alternatives that we could in fact put into place if there is a new administration. So thanks so much to all of you. And thank you. Again, thank you for your leadership.